My name is Morgan Shaw. I'm in my early 30s now, and I work in healthcare operations, one of those behind-the-scenes roles where you notice patterns before anyone else does, because your job depends on staying calm while other people are emotional. Most people who meet me describe me the same way: quiet, reliable, composed. Someone once said I have a soothing presence, which I think was meant as a compliment. I've learned that what people often hear in that description is something else entirely. That I won't make trouble, that I'll wait my turn, that I'll endure. I wasn't always aware of how much that perception shaped the way others treated me. For a long time, I believed being easy to be around was a kind of moral achievement. I thought if I stayed reasonable, patient, and understanding, things would eventually balance out. This story is about the moment I learned that patience, without agency, can quietly cost you more than anger ever could. What I'm going to share happened when I was 17, but it didn't end there. It stretched across years, into adulthood, into my sense of safety, into how I understand family and responsibility. The headline version sounds dramatic. My parents refused to sign my surgery consent while I was bleeding, and doctors waited as my family argued about who was responsible. But this isn't a story about villains or heroics. There's no revenge arc here. No shouting matches, no cinematic speeches. What unfolded was slower, quieter, and in many ways more unsettling than open conflict. This is a story about what happens when everyone assumes someone else will step up, and how that assumption can leave one person completely alone in a room full of people. It's about being underestimated, not because you are weak, but because you appear manageable. It's about systems, family systems, medical systems that pause when responsibility becomes inconvenient. And it's about the kind of power that doesn't announce itself, because it doesn't need to. I want to be clear about something from the beginning. I'm not telling this to shock you, and I'm not telling it to punish anyone. I'm telling it because it took me years to understand why that day mattered so much, and even longer to see how quietly it shaped every decision I made afterward. There are moments in life that don't feel dramatic while they're happening, but later, you realize they divided your life into a before and an after. If you're listening to this because you've ever been the easy one, the reasonable one, the person everyone assumes will be fine, I see you. And as you listen, I'd like you to gently ask yourself, what moments in your own life have you been minimizing simply because no one else seemed alarmed? Before I was 17, before hospitals and consent forms and blood that wouldn't stop, I already had a role. I just didn't know it had been assigned to me so early. To my parents, I was the easy one, not the dramatic one, not the problem child, not the one who needed extra meetings with teachers or careful conversations at the dinner table. I did well in school. I didn't ask for much. I learned quickly which questions were welcome and which ones created sighs, delays, or that look that meant, not now. So I adapted. I stopped asking. People like to say some children are naturally independent. What they usually mean is that the child learned independence because waiting for help felt uncertain. At family gatherings, I was the helper, the one clearing plates before being asked, the one who noticed when drinks were empty. If something went missing, I was asked first, not because I was suspected, but because I was observant, reliable, useful. I absorbed that word without realizing how heavy it would become later. No one ever described me as fragile, or sensitive, or someone whose limits might matter. At school, teachers praised my maturity. Morgan doesn't need supervision. Morgan will handle it. When group projects went sideways, I was quietly repositioned as the stabilizer. Not the leader, just the one who would make sure it got done. I wore that like a badge of honor. Being needed felt close enough to being valued that I didn't question the difference. At home, conflict happened around me, not with me. My parents argued about finances, about schedules, about responsibilities, but rarely to me. Decisions were announced, not discussed. I was informed, not consulted. And because I rarely protested, it reinforced the belief that I was fine with that arrangement. I learned early that if I stayed calm, adults stayed comfortable. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being the good one. You don't disappear entirely. You're still present, still counted on. But your inner life becomes optional to others. Your discomfort is treated as temporary, manageable, something you'll sort out quietly, on your own. I didn't think of it as neglect. That word felt too harsh, too dramatic. Nothing terrible was happening after all. I was fed, I was clothed, I was praised, and yet there was an unspoken understanding that my needs were flexible in a way others weren't. If I were tired, I could push through. If I were uncomfortable, I could wait. If I were hurt, I would recover. That assumption followed me everywhere. Friends leaned on me during crises, then forgot to check in afterward. The extended family introduced me as the responsible one, smiling as if that was a complete description of a person. Doctors spoke over me during routine appointments, directing explanations toward my parents, even when I answered clearly and correctly. And I didn't object. I thought objecting would mean I was difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. What I didn't understand then was that being underestimated doesn't always look like disrespect. Sometimes it looks like trust that's never verified, like silence that's mistaken for consent, like decisions being made around you instead of with you. I was 17 the year my body began to fail me in a way I couldn't manage quietly. But even before that, the pattern was already set. When something went wrong, people expected me to endure first and explain later, if at all. Looking back now, I can see how consistently I was framed as someone whose resilience was endless, as if calmness were proof of capacity, as if composure meant consent. I don't think anyone consciously decided that my pain mattered less. I think they simply believed I could handle it. And when everyone believes that at the same time, responsibility has a way of evaporating. At 17, I still believed that if something was truly serious, adults would step in. Those systems would engage. That family would close ranks. I believed there was an invisible line, a threshold, beyond which my quiet endurance would no longer be expected. I was wrong about where that line was. And I was wrong about who would notice when it was crossed. The first sign that something was wrong didn't arrive dramatically. It never does. It was a dull pain at first. Low, persistent, easy to dismiss. I remember sitting in class, shifting in my chair, telling myself it was stress or dehydration or something hormonal that would pass if I ignored it long enough. I had learned that lesson well. Don't rush to label discomfort as a problem. Problems inconvenience people. By the end of that week, the pain had sharpened. Not enough to stop me from going to school, but enough that I noticed how carefully I moved, how I timed my breaths, how I started mapping out where bathrooms were, just in case. I didn't tell anyone at first. I told myself I didn't have enough information yet. It would be irresponsible to worry people prematurely. That was the first small cut, not physical, but psychological. The moment I chose silence because it felt more reasonable than asking for attention. When I finally mentioned it to my mother, I did so casually. I remember leaning against the kitchen counter, keeping my voice light, almost apologetic. "I've been having some pain," I said. "Probably nothing. I just thought I should mention it." She looked up from what she was doing and nodded. Not dismissively, just neutrally. "Okay, we'll keep an eye on it." "We'll keep an eye on it" became the holding pattern for everything after that. Over the next few days, the symptoms escalated in ways that were harder to ignore. I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. I started missing meals without meaning to. There were moments when the pain spiked suddenly, catching my breath mid-sentence. Still, I downplayed it. Still, I translated my experience into something more palatable. "It's uncomfortable. It's probably stress. It's not urgent." Those words mattered more than I understood at the time. Because adults listen closely to the language you give them. They take their cues from your tone. And I had learned to sound manageable. When we eventually went to see a doctor, the appointment felt routine. Too routine. The questions were asked quickly. The answers were summarized, not explored. I noticed how the doctor addressed my parents more than me, even when I was the one answering. I noticed how the conversation stayed comfortably vague. "Let's monitor it." Could be a number of things. Come back if it gets worse. There it was again. The assumption that I would know when worse had arrived, that I would speak up clearly, decisively, without minimizing. But by then, minimizing was my default setting. The real shift happened quietly, one afternoon when I realized I was bleeding in a way that wasn't normal. Not catastrophic, not cinematic, just enough to register that something inside me was no longer contained. I remember standing in the bathroom, staring at evidence I didn't have language for, feeling oddly detached. My first thought wasn't fear, it was logistics. How bad does this have to be before it counts? I told my parents. This time, I didn't cushion it as much. I said the word bleeding. I expected the tone in the room to change, for urgency to enter the conversation. Instead, there was a pause. Concern, yes, but still measured, still cautious, still waiting for confirmation from somewhere else. My mother asked questions. My father suggested we call the doctor. No one said, "We're going to the hospital now." So we waited. Waiting became the theme of that week. Waiting for callbacks, waiting for appointments, waiting to see if it would stop on its own. I learned how to fold myself around discomfort so it wouldn't alarm anyone. I learned how to answer, "How are you feeling?" with "about the same," because worse felt like an accusation. What I didn't realize then was that each delay was teaching me something. Teaching me that urgency is contagious only when someone names it first. Teaching me that if you don't sound like an emergency, you may not be treated like one. The first small cut wasn't the pain. It wasn't the bleeding. It was the moment I understood that my body could signal distress and still be negotiated. That concern could exist without action. That responsibility could hover in the room without ever landing on anyone. I remember thinking, very clearly, if this were happening to someone else, this would be moving faster. But I didn't say that out loud, because I was still trying to be reasonable, still trying to be easy, still trying not to be a problem. I didn't know yet how much that restraint would cost me. Once something unsettling becomes routine, it stops triggering an alarm. It just becomes background noise. That's how normalization works. Not through a single moment of cruelty, but through repetition that teaches you what not to expect. By the time the bleeding became frequent enough that I planned my days around it, the concern in my household had softened into logistics. Which days could we schedule appointments? Which symptoms were worth mentioning? Which ones were probably just part of it? The language shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly from "what's wrong" to "how are we managing?" I noticed that shift before anyone else did. Every update I gave was met with some version of patience. Not urgency, patience. The kind that sounds compassionate, but carries no momentum. "Let's see. We'll follow up. These things can be complicated." Each phrase landed like a soft hand on my shoulder, gently pressing me back into place. At school, I kept functioning. That felt important. Proof, maybe, that everyone was right not to worry too much. I showed up, took notes, and smiled at the right moments. I learned how to ignore the tightness in my chest when the pain flared unexpectedly. I learned how to calculate how long I could stand before dizziness crept in. I learned how to excuse myself without explanation. People praised my resilience. That praise became another layer of pressure. Because once you're labeled resilient, struggling feels like failure. What struck me most, looking back, wasn't that anyone was overtly unkind. It was that no one adjusted their expectations. Not my parents, not my teachers, not the adults who had the authority to say, "This is no longer normal." Instead, the responsibility kept drifting back toward me. I was asked to track symptoms, to articulate changes, to decide when it was bad enough, as if pain came with a clear instruction manual, as if a 17-year-old should be the final authority on her own medical emergency. I began to doubt myself. Was I exaggerating? Was I misinterpreting? Was I being impatient? Self-doubt is efficient. It keeps things quiet. I remember one evening sitting at the dinner table, barely touching my food, when my father asked, "Are you sure it hasn't improved at all?" Not accusatory, just hopeful. I felt the familiar pull to reassure, to soften, to say something that would let everyone relax. "It's manageable," I said. That word manageable became my undoing. Because manageable implies control, and once you imply control, others feel less obligated to intervene. I watched it happen in real time. The subtle relief in the room, the unspoken agreement that we were still within acceptable limits. Doctor's appointments followed a similar pattern. I answered questions carefully, aware that my phrasing mattered. I didn't want to be dismissed, but I also didn't want to be dramatic. So I walked the line. I used neutral language. I described facts without emotion. I thought that would make me credible. What I didn't understand then was that neutrality can be misread as stability. At one appointment, I remember the doctor pausing, flipping through my chart and saying, "Well, if you were in severe distress, you'd look different." He smiled when he said it, as if that settled something. I smiled back. That moment stayed with me. The idea that distress had a look, a volume, a posture, and that if you didn't perform it convincingly, you could be deferred. At home, the conversations became circular. Each person assumed someone else was monitoring the situation more closely. My parents assumed the doctors would escalate if needed. The doctors assumed my parents would bring me in if things worsened. And I, quietly, dutifully, filled in the gaps by enduring. This is how disrespect can exist without malice, not through denial, but through diffusion. No single person saying no, just everyone saying later. I told myself this was normal, that healthcare is slow, that families navigate uncertainty all the time. I told myself not to personalize it, but there was a growing, uncomfortable awareness forming beneath those rationalizations. I was not being protected, not because anyone wished me harm, but because my calm made it easy to postpone action. My compliance made the delay feel safe. My silence made room for everyone else's comfort. The hardest part was realizing that I was participating in this dynamic. I was translating my pain into something digestible. I was editing myself for the sake of efficiency. I was, in effect, making it easier for others to underestimate the situation. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. I began to understand that being treated reasonably does not always mean being treated responsibly. That politeness can coexist with neglect. That respect isn't just about tone, it's about response. Still, I stayed quiet. Because at 17, you trust that adults will know when enough is enough. You trust that there is a safeguard you don't have to activate yourself. I didn't know yet that I was approaching a moment where silence would no longer be neutral, where it would become a decision, whether I intended it to or not. By the time the situation reached the hospital, my role was already fully formed. I didn't walk in as a patient whose needs would reorganize the room. I walked in as someone everyone assumed would cooperate. Hospitals are efficient in a way that feels impersonal until you need them not to be. They move on to protocols, consent forms, and chains of responsibility. And when something doesn't fit neatly into those systems, everything slows down. I remember the intake desk, the clipped questions, the way my answers were translated into checkboxes. I remember being placed on a bed, a thin blanket tucked around me with practiced neutrality. No one was unkind. No one was alarmed enough either. I was 17, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough that nothing could proceed without a signature. That's when the conversations shifted away from me. Doctors spoke to my parents in lowered voices at the foot of the bed. Nurses adjusted the equipment, then paused. I could hear words like procedure, risk, and consent. I could also hear hesitation, not medical hesitation, administrative. There was a surgery they wanted to perform, not optional, not cosmetic, necessary to stop the bleeding that hadn't resolved on its own. I understood that much. I also understood that nothing was going to happen until someone signed. I watched my parents process this information in real time. I watched concern flicker, then get tangled with something else. Fear, maybe, or confusion, or the weight of responsibility landing too suddenly. Questions were asked, clarifications requested, time stretched. I was still bleeding. I remember thinking that someone would take charge, that one of the adults in the room would say, "This is happening now." Instead, the discussion turned procedural. Risks, alternatives, whose decision it technically was. I wasn't asked how I felt. Not really. I wasn't brought into the conversation as a participant. I was the subject, not the agent. At one point, I spoke up. My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. If they think it's necessary, then I want to do it. The room acknowledged that statement politely and then moved past it. Because my wanting wasn't legally actionable, what followed was a quiet standoff that felt surreal in its calmness. My parents didn't refuse outright. They hesitated. They asked for more time. They wanted reassurance. And the doctors, bound by protocol, waited. No one raised their voice. No one said no. No one said yes. I lay there, watching adults debate responsibility, while my body continued to do what it had been doing for weeks, fail in small, persistent ways. The monitors beeped softly. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic. Everything looked controlled. That's what made it so unsettling. I realized in that moment that the role I had been playing my entire life had followed me here. I was still the reasonable one. The patient is one. The one expected to endure a little longer so others could feel certain. The doctors assumed my parents would decide quickly. My parents assumed the doctors would push harder if it was truly urgent. And I assumed, because I had always assumed that someone else would intervene if the line was crossed. But lines don't announce themselves. They erode. Time passed in increments I couldn't measure. Minutes felt abstract. What I could measure was the growing distance between my body and the people discussing it. I felt increasingly irrelevant to decisions being made about me. No one meant for it to become an argument. But it did, in the quietest way possible. Responsibility bounced back and forth without ever settling. And in that gap, nothing happened. This was the role I had been assigned without ever agreeing to it. The one who waits, the one who absorbs delay, the one whose suffering is unfortunate but not catalytic. I remember a nurse meeting my eyes briefly as she passed. There was something apologetic there, something constrained. It told me more than words could have. The system was working as designed, and that design did not center me. Lying there, I felt something shift internally. Not anger, not panic, something colder, clearer. The realization that being calm does not guarantee being cared for. That compliance can make you invisible at the worst possible moment. And that if I survived this, I would never again assume that someone else would protect me simply because they were supposed to. That understanding didn't change the situation immediately, but it changed me. There was no dramatic turning point. No raised voices. No sudden rush of staff into the room. The day something shifted happened almost entirely inside me, in the quiet spaces between questions that went unanswered. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations to keep my mind anchored. I remember the weight of the blanket on my legs, and how it felt heavier than it should have. I remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity, this is what waiting looks like when it's no longer neutral. Time had slowed into something viscous. Conversations restarted and stopped. My parents stepped out to talk privately. Doctors came in, then left again. Each movement suggested progress without delivering it. Each pause carried the same unspoken message. Not yet. What surprised me most was how quickly fear drained away. I had expected panic. Instead, I felt a narrowing, a sharpening. My attention turned inward, not to the pain, though it was still there, but to the structure of the moment. I saw how responsibility was being handled. No one was refusing me care. That would have been easier to name. What was happening was more subtle. Responsibility was being deferred in the name of caution. And caution, I realized, can be a very comfortable place to hide. I thought about all the times I had been told to wait, to be patient, to trust the process. I had done that faithfully. I had done it so well that now, when the process stalled, I had no leverage left inside it. That was the shift. I stopped assuming that urgency would be recognized automatically. I stopped believing that systems escalate themselves. I stopped thinking that calmness would protect me. Instead, I began to observe. I watched how questions were framed. I noticed which words made adults lean in and which ones allowed them to lean back. I saw how liability hovered over every decision like a fog. How no one wanted to be the person who moved too fast, even if moving slowly carried its own risks. At one point, a doctor explained, carefully, thoroughly, what the surgery would involve. He spoke as if clarity itself were the solution. When he finished, there was a pause. He looked at my parents. "And are you comfortable proceeding?" he asked. The question hung there. I understood then that comfort, not necessity, was driving the timeline. Something inside me settled, not into acceptance, into resolve. I realized I had been waiting for permission to matter. Waiting for someone to look at me and say, "Your body is the priority now." And that permission wasn't coming, not because I didn't deserve it, but because the structure of the moment didn't reward decisiveness. I couldn't change that from the bed I was in, but I could change what I learned from it. When my parents came back into the room, they looked exhausted, torn. I felt a wave of empathy for them, and then something else underneath it, an understanding that empathy alone was not enough to keep me safe. I spoke again. This time my voice was still calm, but it was firmer. "I need this to stop," I said. "Not what I want, not I think. I need." The adults acknowledged me. Again, and again the system paused. That was when it fully clicked. Being heard is not the same as being acted on. I didn't fight. I didn't plead. I didn't raise my voice. I lay there and absorbed the reality of my position. And in doing so, I made a quiet promise to myself. If I got through this, I would never again outsource my sense of urgency. I would learn the language that moves rooms. I would understand how decisions are actually made, not how we're told they're made. Eventually, after more discussion, the consent was signed. The surgery was scheduled. Action followed, but not before that internal line had been crossed. The shift wasn't relief, it was clarity. I saw, with uncomfortable precision, how easily a person can be deprioritized without anyone meaning harm. How systems favor those who assert, not those who endure. How being reasonable can become a liability when the stakes are high. As they prepared to move me, a nurse squeezed my hand briefly. "You did the right thing," she said quietly. I didn't know what she meant at the time. I hadn't done anything, not outwardly, but inwardly, something fundamental had changed. I was no longer waiting to be protected. I was watching, learning, and storing this moment away, not as trauma, but as information. Because information, I would come to learn, is where quiet power begins. After the surgery, people assumed the hardest part was over. The bleeding stopped. The crisis, as it was later referred to, had been resolved. From the outside, it looked like a clean ending. Intervention just in time, outcomes stabilized, lessons learned. But something subtle had shifted in how I used silence. Before, my quiet had been automatic, a reflex. Now it was deliberate. Recovery gave me time to think. Hospitals have a way of stripping life down to essentials: pain scales, vital signs, short conversations punctuated by long stretches of stillness. In that stillness, I replayed everything, not with outrage, but with analysis. I wasn't angry at my parents. That surprised me. I understood their hesitation. Fear can paralyze even loving people. What unsettled me more was how easily the system had allowed that paralysis to delay care. How my earlier calm had been factored into the equation as evidence that waiting was acceptable. I began to understand that silence isn't neutral. It's data. People read it, interpret it, and act, or don't act, accordingly. When I returned home, everyone treated me carefully for a while. There were check-ins, offers of help, concern wrapped in guilt maybe. I accepted it politely. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't recount the hospital scene. I didn't demand accountability. From the outside, it probably looked like I had returned to my old role, the reasonable one, grateful for care, eager to move on. But internally, I was recalibrating. I noticed how quickly concern faded once I appeared stable, how conversations shifted back to normal rhythms, how my recovery was framed as a success story rather than a near miss. No one asked what it felt like to wait while adults debated. No one asked what it had done to my sense of safety. So I stopped offering that information, not out of spite, out of clarity. I began to observe how people responded to different versions of me. When I minimized, things stayed easy. When I stated facts plainly, without cushioning, rooms changed slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to register. I learned that people are often more comfortable with quiet endurance than with quiet certainty. Silence became something I used strategically. I no longer filled gaps to ease discomfort. I let pauses stretch. I let questions hang. I answered precisely, not reassuringly. At doctor's appointments after that, I described symptoms without apology. No qualifiers, no nervous laughter. I noticed the difference immediately. Charts updated faster, follow-up questions sharpened, timelines shortened. No one ever said, "You sound different," but they acted differently. At home, I listened more than I spoke, not passively, intentionally. I paid attention to how responsibility was discussed, how decisions were deferred, and how assumptions were made. I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before. Who was expected to adapt? Who was allowed to hesitate? Who carried the cost of the delay? And I didn't interrupt those patterns. I let people underestimate me. That might sound like retreat, but it wasn't. It was positioning. When people believe they understand you completely, they stop monitoring you closely. They stop anticipating resistance. They reveal more than they realize. I was still polite, still calm, still helpful when I chose to be. But my silence no longer came from a desire to be easy. It came from a desire to see clearly. What I learned during that time was simple and unsettling. Systems don't change because someone suffers quietly. They change when someone knows where to apply pressure. I wasn't applying pressure yet. I was learning where it could be applied. And while everyone else believed the story had ended with my recovery, I understood that it had only shifted into a different phase. One that required patience of a different kind. Not the patience of endurance, but the patience of preparation. Silence, when chosen, becomes a kind of leverage. Not because it hides weakness, but because it creates space to think. And I was thinking very carefully. What people didn't notice was how much attention I was paying. On the surface, my life resumed its familiar shape. School, recovery checkups, family routines that smoothed themselves back into place as if nothing fundamental had been disrupted. I was still calm, still compliant, still, by all visible measures, the same person. But underneath that continuity, I was collecting data. I started with my own medical records. At first, it was practical: dates, procedures, follow-ups. Then it became something else. I read notes more closely than I had before. I noticed how language shifted responsibility. Words like patient reports versus family indicate delay due to consent clarification, no acute distress observed. I understood then how stories are shaped long before they're told aloud. I learned which details were emphasized and which were softened. How timelines were described in ways that felt technically accurate but emotionally incomplete. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for structure. I wanted to understand how a situation like mine could stall without anyone technically failing. At 17, I didn't have legal power, but I had time and attention and a growing awareness that knowledge doesn't need to be loud to be effective. I began reading, not obsessively, but steadily, about patient advocacy, about consent laws, about how hospitals assess urgency. I learned the difference between necessary and elective in clinical language. I learned how risk is weighed, not just medically, but administratively. None of this felt dramatic, it felt methodical. I kept notes in a slim leather notebook I'd had for years, originally meant for school assignments. I didn't label it anything significant, just dates, observations, questions I didn't ask out loud, patterns I noticed across appointments. No one ever saw that notebook as a threat. It looked harmless, academic, and that was the point. At home, I listened to how my parents talked about the hospital experience when others asked. The story was always the same: scary, stressful, but handled. A delay, yes, but understandable. No one was blamed. The system worked. I didn't correct them. I noticed something else, too. How quickly people stopped checking in once I appeared functional again. Once I was upright, smiling, making plans. Recovery, I learned, is often interpreted as closure, even when the emotional aftermath hasn't been addressed. That realization stayed with me. As I got older, I gravitated toward environments where systems mattered, where decisions were made behind closed doors, where outcomes depended less on intention and more on process. I didn't choose healthcare operations consciously because of what happened, but it made sense once I was there. I understood the language, the pauses, the careful wording. I saw how easily responsibility can blur in complex environments, how people with good intentions rely on protocols to shield them from personal accountability, and how those protocols leave gaps that only affect people who don't know how to push back. What no one noticed was that I was building an internal map of how authority flows, of where decisions stall, of how calm compliance is interpreted as capacity rather than constraint. I never announced this shift. I didn't share insights. I didn't confront old wounds. I let people continue believing I had moved on without residue. Because what I was really doing was integrating a lesson I had learned the hard way, that power rarely arrives suddenly. It accumulates quietly, through understanding. The version of me they saw, the composed, cooperative one, was still real, but it was no longer the whole picture. I had learned how to stand inside systems without disappearing into them, how to be underestimated without being unprepared, how to let silence do work that words sometimes can't. By the time I reached adulthood, the girl who had waited in a hospital bed while others debated was no longer waiting for anyone to recognize urgency on her behalf. She was learning how to recognize leverage. And she was patient. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush of triumph, no moment where I leaned back and thought, so that's it. It arrived quietly, the way most real clarity does. I was in my mid-20s, working late, reviewing a process map that traced how medical decisions escalated or failed to. It was the kind of document most people skim: boxes, arrows, conditional steps. But I had learned to read what wasn't on the page as carefully as what was. That's when it settled into place. Not a single insight, but a convergence. I saw how much authority is based on perceived urgency rather than actual harm. How decisiveness is often mistaken for certainty. How systems respond fastest not to need, but to risk. Risk to institutions, to liability, to reputation. And I understood, with unsettling clarity, why I had waited so long on that hospital bed. It wasn't because my case was unclear. It wasn't because no one cared. It was because no one owned the risk yet. My parents were afraid of making the wrong decision. The doctors were constrained by consent. The system allowed hesitation to masquerade as caution. And my calm presence had reassured everyone that time was still on their side. That was the private reveal. Urgency is not inherent. It is asserted. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I thought back to my 17-year-old self, steady-voiced, cooperative, waiting. I realized that nothing about my situation had forced anyone to move faster. There was no trigger strong enough to compel action until consent was finally given. Not because the risk had changed, but because someone finally accepted ownership. That understanding was sobering and strangely grounding. It meant what happened to me wasn't a fluke. It was predictable, reproducible, built into the structure of how decisions are delayed when responsibility feels heavy. And if that was true, then the inverse was also true. I began to notice how people who moved systems quickly spoke, how they framed issues. They didn't beg, they didn't over-explain. They identified risk, named responsibility, and narrowed options until delay became uncomfortable. They made waiting feel dangerous. This wasn't manipulation, it was fluence. I realized that for years, I had been speaking a language that optimized comfort rather than outcomes. I had been translating my needs into something easy to hold, and the system had responded accordingly. The reveal wasn't empowering in the way movies make empowerment look. It didn't make me feel invincible. It made me feel accountable to myself. Because now I knew that silence could be a choice, but so could precision. I knew that calm could coexist with firmness. I knew that being reasonable didn't require being deferential. And I knew that if I ever found myself, or someone I was responsible for, in a similar position again, I would not rely on others to feel urgency on my behalf. That knowledge didn't turn me into someone loud. It turned me into someone exact. I didn't confront my parents with this realization. There was no need. Understanding doesn't always require exposure. Some truths are meant to change how you move, not how you accuse. What mattered was that the story I told myself about that hospital day finally aligned with reality. I stopped framing it as a failure of care or a lapse of love. I understood it as a lesson in how power actually works when no one intends harm. And once you understand that, you don't waste energy wishing things had been different. You adjust, quietly, permanently. Understanding something and acting on it are two different things. For a long time after that private reveal, I carried the knowledge without deploying it. I adjusted internally. I refined how I spoke. I became more precise in professional settings. But there was still a part of me that treated what I'd learned as defensive, something to use if things went wrong again. The decision point came when I realized that waiting to act was just another form of deferral. It didn't happen in a crisis. It happened during a quiet, ordinary moment, one of those moments that don't announce their importance until much later. I was reviewing a case at work where a vulnerable patient had experienced delays eerily similar to mine. Different details, same structure, the same diffusion of responsibility, the same assumption that time was neutral. I felt a familiar tightening, not panic, not anger, but recognition. I saw exactly how this would play out if nothing changed. How everyone involved would later say they did their part. How the outcome would be explained as unfortunate, but unavoidable. How the person at the center would be left holding consequences no one intended. And I realized something uncomfortable. I was now old enough, experienced enough, and positioned well enough that my silence would no longer be incidental. If I stayed quiet, it wouldn't be because I didn't know better. It would be because I chose not to intervene. That was the decision point. There were multiple options in front of me, and I could see them clearly. I could remain within my defined role, do what was asked, no more, no less. I could flag concerns gently and accept whatever pace followed. Or I could do something irreversible. I could start naming risk explicitly, even when it made others uncomfortable. That last option came with consequences. I knew that. Systems don't resist disruption loudly, they resist it subtly, through stalled advancement, through reputational labels, through being described as difficult. Even when you're right. I weighed that carefully. For most of my life, Being seen as easy had been a form of safety. Letting go of that came with real cost. But I also understood now what that safety had been built on and who paid for it. So I chose the irreversible option. Not dramatically, not publicly. I didn't announce a new philosophy or position myself as a crusader. I began to do something much quieter and much more effective. I stopped cushioning urgency. When timelines were vague, I asked who owned the decision. When responsibility was shared, I asked where it landed. When delays were framed as caution, I asked what risk that caution introduced. I documented everything, calmly, precisely. I followed processes, but I also traced accountability. I learned how to escalate without sounding emotional, how to make inaction visible without accusation. Once you do that, there's no going back. People begin to respond differently. Conversations sharpen, decisions move. Sometimes resentment follows, but so does clarity, and clarity changes outcomes. This wasn't about control, it was about alignment, about making sure that the weight of delay no longer lands on the most vulnerable person by default. The decision I made wasn't loud enough to be celebrated, but it was permanent. I would no longer trade my own urgency, or anyone else's, for collective comfort. I didn't need everyone to agree with me. I didn't need approval. I needed decisions to be owned. That was the moment I stopped being shaped by what happened to me at 17 and started shaping what would happen next. And once you cross that line, you don't drift back. Once I made that decision, nothing about my life looked different from the outside. That was intentional. There's a misconception that meaningful change announces itself, that people draw lines, issue ultimatums, or dramatically redefine themselves. In reality, the most consequential shifts often happen quietly, through consistency rather than confrontation. I didn't tell anyone I was changing how I moved through the world. I just did. At work, I became meticulous in ways that were easy to underestimate. I documented conversations that others summarized. I clarified the next steps when others assumed alignment. When someone said, "We'll circle back," I asked when and noted the answer. When responsibility was shared across departments, I traced exactly where it paused. I wasn't aggressive, I wasn't oppositional, I was calm, steady, and precise. That combination unsettles people more than anger ever could. What made this phase powerful was that no one felt attacked. There was no confrontation to push back against, just facts, timelines, and a quiet insistence on follow-through. Delays no longer dissolved into ambiguity. They accumulated weight. I noticed something almost immediately. People began preparing before meeting with me. Not because I demanded it, but because they understood that vagueness wouldn't hold. Conversations moved faster. Decisions landed more clearly. And when something stalled, it stalled with a name attached. Outside of work, I made similar adjustments. In medical settings, I asked for clarity without apology. I requested copies of records as a matter of habit. I confirmed the next steps before leaving the rooms. I learned how to phrase questions so that answers became commitments rather than possibilities. No one called this behavior difficult. It was too neutral for that. Too reasonable. It simply removed the option to drift. With my family, the changes were even quieter. I didn't reopen old wounds. I didn't recount the hospital day in detail. I just stopped absorbing responsibility that wasn't mine. When decisions needed to be made, I let silence sit where I used to step in. When assumptions were made about my availability or flexibility, I corrected them calmly. Not defensively, factually. People noticed, but they couldn't quite name what had changed. I was still composed, still thoughtful, still kind, but I was no longer buffering discomfort for others. What they felt, I think, was the absence of something they'd relied on without realizing it. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without performance, without the need to be seen as righteous or justified. It means letting outcomes speak for themselves, while you remain emotionally unentangled from the reaction. There were moments when I was tempted to explain myself, to say, "This is why I'm doing things differently," but explanation invites negotiation. And I wasn't negotiating anymore. I had learned that clarity doesn't need consensus. What mattered was that the patterns I'd once been trapped in were no longer available to me. Delay couldn't settle quietly. Responsibility couldn't float indefinitely. My calm no longer translated into compliance. And because I hadn't announced any of this, no one could accuse me of changing. They could only respond to the new reality I was creating. That's the strength of quiet movement. It doesn't provoke resistance until it's already effective. By the time anyone fully noticed the consequences, the structure had shifted enough that going back wasn't an option. And that's when the consequences began. Not for me, but for the people who had assumed things would always stay as they were. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. That's important. No one was singled out. No one was confronted. What happened was quieter and more disorienting for the people around me. Things simply stopped being as easy as they used to be. At work, projects that once drifted forward on vague assurances now required decisions sooner. People who were accustomed to postponing calls or deferring ownership found that those options had narrowed. When something stalled, it didn't disappear into the background. It resurfaced, documented, time-stamped, and unresolved. Not aggressively, persistently. I noticed a shift in tone during meetings. People spoke more carefully, they prepared more thoroughly. Not because I demanded excellence, but because ambiguity no longer felt safe. They could sense that if something went unclaimed, it wouldn't quietly default to me. That was new. Before, I had absorbed uncertainty like a sponge. I'd filled gaps, smoothed edges. Now the gaps stayed visible, and visibility changes behavior. Some colleagues felt it at first as an inconvenience, others as pressure they couldn't quite name. A few interpreted it as distance. They'd say things like, "You've been quieter lately," or "You're harder to read." I nodded. I didn't correct them. With my family, the consequences were more personal. They began to notice that I didn't automatically step in anymore, that I didn't mediate, that I didn't volunteer flexibility when plans changed or decisions became messy. When responsibility hovered, I let it hover. At first, they filled the space themselves. Then slowly, discomfort set in. I could see it in small moments. A pause after a question, waiting for me to resolve it. A glance at something that went unresolved. An expectation that didn't land the way it used to. No one accused me of withdrawing. That would have required acknowledging how much I'd been carrying before. Instead, there was confusion. A sense that something essential was missing, but no clear language for what it was. What was missing was my quiet labor. And once it was gone, the weight redistributed. People felt it not as a loss, but as friction. Things took longer. Conversations felt heavier. Decisions required more effort. They weren't being harmed, but they were no longer being buffered. I watched this happen with a kind of detached attentiveness. Not satisfied, not bitterness, just observation. Because this too was information. I saw how quickly people equated my calm presence with availability, how much they had relied on my willingness to absorb uncertainty, and how unprepared they were to manage it themselves once I stepped back. No one apologized. There was nothing concrete to apologize for, but I sensed something else beginning to form, an awareness that the balance had shifted. They didn't yet understand why. That's the unsettling part of quiet change. When patterns break without explanation, people search for external causes. They assume stress, workload, phases. They rarely assume agency. I let them assume whatever they needed to, because the consequences I was interested in weren't emotional reactions. They were structural. They were about who carried responsibility when no one volunteered, about what happened when the most compliant person stopped compensating for everyone else. And what happened was this. Decisions became unavoidable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just inevitable. The systems around me, professional and personal, began to reveal their true capacity once my quiet endurance was no longer propping them up. And that revelation made some people deeply uncomfortable. Discomfort has a way of escalating when it's ignored. At first, the people around me treated the changes as temporary. A phase, stress, growth, something that would eventually settle back into familiarity. They waited for me to resume the role they were used to, the one who smoothed transitions, absorbed tension, and quietly ensured nothing fell apart. But I didn't, and over time, the cost of that absence became harder to dismiss. At work, projects that relied on informal understanding began to stall. People realized too late that no one had formally taken ownership. Questions that would once have landed in my inbox now circulate unanswered. Escalations happened, not because I initiated them, but because unresolved issues finally surfaced on their own. By the time leadership noticed, the narrative had already shifted. It wasn't about one person being difficult. It was about processes that hadn't been sustainable in the first place. That's when the panic started. Not loud panic, quiet scrambling, Meetings scheduled with vague agendas, conversations framed as check-ins, people attempting to re-establish old dynamics without acknowledging what had changed. I was invited into some of those conversations. They sounded concerned. Are you okay? You seem different. We just want to make sure you're supported. Support, I noticed, was being offered only after the system began to strain. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I'm fine, I said, because I was. I wasn't overwhelmed. I wasn't burned out. I was simply no longer compensating. There's a moment when people realize a pattern won't reassemble itself, and that moment is deeply unsettling. They begin to look backward, searching for the point where intervention would have been easier, where a conversation could have reset expectations, where an apology might have mattered. But that moment passes quickly, because once responsibility redistributes, it doesn't politely return to its old place. With my family, the realization came slower and more painfully. They began to sense that something between us had shifted permanently. Not emotionally, I was still present, still caring, but structurally. I no longer oriented myself around their decisions. I didn't wait for consensus to make my own choices. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance. At one point, a family member said, "You don't lean on us the way you used to." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. And underneath it, I heard something else. Regret. But regret arrived too late to reverse anything, because what had changed wasn't my affection. It was my orientation. I no longer positioned myself as someone whose needs could be negotiated in moments of uncertainty. I had learned, the hard way, what that negotiation could cost. There were attempts to re-engage, to revisit old dynamics gently, to check whether I was still open to being the stabilizer, the mediator, the reliable one. I didn't refuse. I just didn't resume. That's the part people don't expect. They think change requires confrontation. Those boundaries need to be declared. But sometimes, the most definitive boundary is consistency. Once people realize that your old role is no longer available, they experience something close to grief. Not for you, but for the ease you provided. And by the time they name that feeling, there's nothing to fix, because nothing is broken. The system is simply being asked to carry its own weight. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look like one. There was no dramatic sit-down, no raised voices, no emotional reckoning where everything spilled out at once. It happened the way most honest things do in adulthood, quietly, almost accidentally, in a moment where avoidance was no longer possible. I was visiting my parents. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where years earlier I had leaned against the counter and said, "It's probably nothing." The conversation drifted the way familiar conversations do, touching lightly on work, schedules, and plans that might happen someday. Then my mother said, very carefully, "You don't tell us much anymore." She wasn't accusing. She wasn't defensive. She sounded uncertain. I let the silence sit. Long enough to make space, not long enough to punish. "I tell you what's relevant," I said. That was it. No edge. No explanation layered on top. Just a statement. My father looked at me, searching my face the way parents do when they're trying to locate the child they remember. "Did we do something?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. Not what answer would be easiest, not what would preserve comfort, just what was true. "You did what you thought was reasonable," I said. "So did I, yada ayama." So did I. That landed harder than any accusation could have. They waited for more, for details, for emotion, for a list. I didn't give them one. I learned from it, I added, and I adjusted. The conversation paused there, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important had been said without heat, without blame, without reopening wounds that couldn't be changed. What I didn't say, but what I think they understood, was this. I no longer needed them to validate what happened in order to move forward. I wasn't asking for acknowledgement or apology. I wasn't carrying resentment that needed release. I had already integrated the lesson. That's what made the moment so disarming. There was nothing to defend against, no emotional charge to push back on, just a calm, immovable reality. They asked a few more questions, tentative ones, about how I make decisions now, about why I seem more contained. I answered selectively, not to withhold, but to be precise. I wasn't there to renegotiate my boundaries. I was there to be honest, without reopening negotiations. At the end of the visit, my mother hugged me a little longer than usual. "I'm glad you're strong," she said. I understood what she meant. and what she missed. Strength hadn't protected me then. Awareness had protected me since. And I didn't correct her. Not because she was wrong, but because I didn't need her understanding to be complete for mine to be valid. That was the final confrontation. Not a reckoning, but a recognition. They saw that the version of me who waited had quietly stepped aside, and that the woman in front of them didn't need anything resolved in order to stand where she was. Sometimes closure doesn't come from agreement. It comes from alignment. The person I am now isn't hardened. That's a misconception people often reach for when they notice someone has become more contained, more deliberate, as if clarity must come from bitterness, as if boundaries are built out of disappointment. That isn't what happened to me. What changed wasn't my capacity for care. It was my understanding of responsibility, where it belongs and where it doesn't. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still the person people describe as steady, but that steadiness no longer comes from absorbing uncertainty or minimizing my own needs. It comes from knowing exactly what I'm responsible for and releasing the rest. I no longer mistake endurance for virtue. In my work, I'm respected not because I'm agreeable, but because I'm consistent. People know what will happen if something is left unresolved. It will remain visible. It will not quietly disappear. And that predictability creates trust of a different kind. I don't rush decisions. I don't dramatize urgency. I simply name it when it exists. In my personal life, I choose relationships where mutual awareness is present, where concern leads to action, not just reassurance, where silence isn't used to avoid discomfort, but to create space for truth. I don't chase understanding anymore. I've learned that not everyone needs to fully grasp your past in order to respect your present. And I don't explain myself by default. The girl I was at 17, the one lying in a hospital bed while adults debated, she isn't someone I pity. She was doing the best she could with the information she had. She trusted that systems would work, that care would escalate naturally, that being reasonable would be enough. She was wrong about that, but she was right about something else. That staying calm could keep her alive long enough to learn. What I carry forward from that experience isn't anger, it's discernment. I know now how easily people confuse composure with capacity. How often are the quiet ones expected to carry more simply because they don't resist? And I know how to step out of that expectation without needing to announce my exit. I don't dominate rooms, I don't seek control, but I don't wait to be prioritized either. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can advocate without aggression, that you can disengage without disappearing, that you can be kind without being consumable. That's who I am now. Not someone who was broken and rebuilt, but someone who learned, precisely and permanently, how not to be misplaced again. When people ask what the lesson of this story is, they usually expect something dramatic. A warning, a call to action, a declaration about trust or betrayal or strength. But the truth is quieter than that. What happened to me at 17 didn't teach me that my parents were careless, or that doctors were cruel, or that systems are broken beyond repair. It taught me something more precise and more useful. It taught me that care without ownership can still cause harm. Everyone involved in that hospital room believed they were being reasonable. They were cautious. They were thoughtful. They were trying not to make the wrong decision. And in that effort, they allowed time to pass in a moment when time mattered. No one intended for me to wait while bleeding. No one intended for responsibility to stall. But intention doesn't prevent impact. For a long time, I thought the problem was that no one listened closely enough. Now I understand it differently. People were listening, but they were listening for reassurance, not urgency. And because I had learned how to sound manageable, that's what they heard. That's the part that is hardest to accept. Sometimes the way you've survived becomes the reason you're overlooked. This story isn't about blame. It's about awareness, about recognizing how easily systems, families, institutions, relationships lean on the quietest person in the room to absorb uncertainty, about how often responsibility drifts until someone claims it, and about what happens when no one does. If there's a moral here, it's this. Your calm does not obligate you to endure. You are allowed to name urgency, even when your voice is steady. You are allowed to ask for action without causing distress. You are allowed to stop cushioning the truth so others can stay comfortable. And if you're someone who tends to hesitate, who waits for certainty before acting, this story is an invitation too. An invitation to notice when caution becomes deferral, when reassurance replaces responsibility, when waiting costs more than deciding. I don't tell this story to reopen the past. I tell it because there are versions of this moment happening every day, in rooms that look calm from the outside. People are waiting quietly, systems pausing politely, time is passing anyway. If you've ever been the one who waited, because you trusted, because you didn't want to be difficult, because you believed someone else would step in, I hope this helps you see that your awareness matters. And if you've ever been on the other side, hesitating, unsure, meaning well, I hope it helps you recognize the moment when someone needs you to own the decision. So I'll leave you with this question, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late, that calmness in a room was mistaken for safety? And what did you do differently after you saw it? Thank you for listening.